recently read a book called Subtle Acts of Exclusion. And
Hmm.
it turns out that the author, Dr. Tiffany Jana, um, was actually looking to give the word microaggressions a facelift, a rebrand. Let's start over. And I'm wondering, in terms of microaggressions in the workplace and changing culture, like you said, you really can't. It's make or break with the leadership, with the management teams, like how they hold
Absolutely.
culture, how they hold space for people to show up and be who they are, and really add value. And the idea of having terminology that it encourages um, great dialogue and exchanges in a safe space versus language that actually cuts people off or makes them feel bad. Um, with microaggressions, there's, according to this author, and I happen to believe, there's nothing small about it. And most people that are committing them um, don't feel that they're being aggressive, right? They're usually the people that are trying not to be. So it's
Yeah.
really interesting that this author is looking at the idea of these are subtle, they're acts of exclusion, and that's what they are, and they need to be called out. And most times it is an opportunity for education. Um, I just think it's an interesting concept of just taking on the language. So we have this bias on which we're acting upon, but it doesn't necessarily it manifests in our space, but it's not something people hear or see or a specific behavior, right? It's just kind of something you carry around with you that will cause you to do, take action A or B or feel a certain way. But these microaggressions or subtle acts of exclusion are learning opportunities. So I think that's a really interesting idea about taking on these things. Like always assuming in the workplace that someone is going to bring. If you're looking at me and automatically assuming that I'm going to bring my husband to the event, as opposed to not allowing me to reveal who my partner is, or those
Yeah.
kinds of things.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I gave a quick seminar this morning to a few team members that we work with, and I'm sure you're familiar with Brene Brown,
Hmm.
and she's an incredible author, and she's an even better public speaker. And I dove back into one of her TED Talks this week, and there was a quote that really resonated with me that I think is applicable here, and I have it pulled up. And the quote was this: it was that. It is, that refraining from having conversations about inclusion and diversity in the workplace because they make you feel uncomfortable is the very definition of privilege. And
Hmm.
if targeted by racism, homophobia, heterosexism, and gender bias are really not responsible for initiating these conversations. And
Hmm.
you're right, like it does take leadership at the very top that will make or break these things. Unfortunately, for the company that I work with, we have an incredible group of leaders at the top who have brought forth with them these ideals and the vision for what this place looks like to work at. And we want to be a leader in this space for our industry, and we want to be known widely as, one of these companies that has transformed a fairly antiquated industry that's not often been, we'll say, like very empathetic to marginalized communities.
Hmm.
And we're doing a great job of that so far. But, part of that cultural change, to your point, is when we sense these microaggressions or we sense the casual use of language or we make assumptions, is calling them out, right?
Hmm.
And having a culture of accountability where it's okay to call things out. And, these conversations and this dialogue is uncomfortable for many people, and that's okay.
Hmm.
Part of the learning process is learning your blind spots. It's kind of like these unintentional microaggressions, right? I'm going to give it an analogy, and it's like that person that has food in their teeth at lunch. Like, you have the option to just kind of let them continue walking around ignorant with this big piece of food or this
Right.
spinach in their
Spinach, yeah.
out, right? And when you call it out, always, regardless of how, what happens, you always kind of feel a little offended when you have food in your teeth.
Right.
And then after a few minutes, you're thankful that someone called it out for you. Otherwise, you'd be walking around all day, embarrassing yourself. And it's
Right.
no different than this topic here is, creating a culture where when you see someone use a phrase or a microaggression, you ask me, hey, what did you mean by that? And is there something better we could say besides this or that? Because they could be seen offensively to someone else, even though you may not have intended it for it to be offensive at all.
Yeah, and I think that's true, and it goes across the board, across all groups and all. In order to be inclusive, you just got to think about your language and how you may or may not be welcoming and inclusive of another person just by your language alone. Maybe
Absolutely.
not your intent. It's not your intent; it's the impact, right? And that's
Sure.
what we're focused on as the impact.